Principles of Microeconomics, Chapter 6, Consumer Choices, Professor Wagner. The outline for this chapter talks about consumption choices, the influence of income and prices affecting that choice, and behavioral economics. Higher education is considered a good choice of investments by many, provided they can afford it. And then, is education only beneficial during the good times, since incomes tend to decrease during recessions? So there are a whole lot of factors that could play into whether this is a good or bad decision, and that will be discussed further in the slides. All consumers have to consider a couple things. They have a budget constraint, which means there's a limited amount of capital or income for any given consumer. And then there's total utility satisfaction from the consumer choice. So basically, does the consumer feel particularly good about his decision to buy a certain product or use his time in a given way, such as going on vacation or whatnot? Did he get a lot of satisfaction from that? So what to take away from this particular slide, and it will be something you'll have to deal with, is understand that utility in economics means satisfaction. You'll probably see that on test. So with respect to utility, and a unit of utility, it's called a util in economics. And so they talk about an additional utility provided by one additional unit of consumption. So the total change in utility divided by the change in quantity, or marginal utility. And then there's a diminishing marginal utility, where the common pattern marginal unit of one good consumed provides less of an addition to the utility than the previous unit. A good example is, well, you can use slices of pizza, for instance, where maybe one, New York slice is, that tastes pretty good. The second one is filling, and the third one is about impossible to eat. So you have diminishing utility. You were starving at the point you ate the first one. You were almost there at the point of eating the second one, and the third one was inconceivable because you're full. So this particular graph talks about a choice between two goods, and the consumption of movies versus that of t-shirts. And Jose, he has a fixed amount of money, $56. Movies, they cost $7 a piece. And so how many movies can he buy at $56? Well, he can go to 8 movies for that. T-shirts, they cost $14. So if he wants t-shirts, all t-shirts, that's $56, 14 times 4. So these are the polar ends. And then the points S, R, and Q are, the quantities in between that can be purchased along this demand line, or demand curve. So the points of the constraints show the combinations of movies and t-shirts that are affordable. Naturally, if I put a point out here, that would be outside the budget constraint, so cannot buy out here. If I put another point here, inside, underneath this demand curve, then we can say Jose hasn't spent all of his money, but has decided not to spend everything, but get a certain combination of movies and t-shirts rather. So there's a margin of utility per dollar, and that's the additional satisfaction gained from a purchasing a good given the price of the product. So you have the marginal utility divided by the price. If you always choose the item with the greatest marginal utility per dollar spent, when the budget's exhausted, that would be utility maximizing. That's what should occur there. And where the marginal utility per dollar spent is the same for both goods. So this needs to equal that. So you reach an optimal point. This is an equation you'll probably want to know for the test. How income changes and pricing change consumer choices. Income, prices, and preferences affect the choices. Those are the 3 typical elements. Utility and marginal utility could also be used to analyze how consumer choices change when the budget constraint shifts in response to changes in income or price. An example would be concert tickets versus overnight getaway when income increases. So in this instance, you know, there's a shift in the number of income increasing. So basically, originally could afford 5 overnight stays or 20 concert tickets or some point in between. And so when this curve shifts to the right, naturally the combinations change out. So on the new budget constraint, a choice like N, this one here, could be made both if both goods are normal goods. If overnight states are inferior to good, choices like P will be made. Right here. If concert tickets are inferior to good, choices like Q will be made. It's all the preference of the consumer. This is an example of how a change in price affects consumer choices. So you have cameras and baseball bats, and the original utility maximizing choice would be M. When the price of bats rises, the budget constraint rotates inward. So you notice that this is a pivot point, and this line basically just swings from this point to this point. And the dashed lines make it possible to see whether the new consumption choice involves less of both goods or less of one good and more of the other. Other possible choices after the bats the price of bats goes up would be fewer baseball bats and more cameras at point H. Choice K would mean that the higher price of bats led to exactly the same quantity of bat consumption, but the consumer just bought fewer cameras. Possibly unlikely choice would be L would be mean a higher price for bat will lead to a greater consumption of bats. Least likely. A typical response to higher prices, and this is intuitive, is they tend to consume less of the product with the higher price. This occurs for two reasons. Substitution effect, and this is something you're going to need to know for the test in terms of a definition. So that's when a price changes, consumer has incentive to consume less of the good with a relatively higher price and more of a good with a relatively lower price, which happens simultaneously with an income effect. Income effect at a higher price, it means the buying power of income has been reduced, even though the actual income has not changed. Always happens simultaneously with a substitution effect. So one has something to do with the other. They're interlinked. Foundations of demand curves. Change in prices of goods lead the budget constraint to rotate. A rotation in the budget constraint means individuals are seeking their highest utility, a quantity that is demanded of a good that will change. In this way, logical foundations of demand curves, the connection between prices and quantities demanded, are the underlying idea of individuals seeking utility. So people tend to want bang for buck is another way to put it. Foundations of a demand curve, the example here is housing. And so you have the original housing price at 0. Housing rises for the first time to P1, P2, and then to P3. And you'll notice that the quantity demanded will move along with that. So you'll have Q of 0. What people would probably get the best utility for would be here, less so at Q1, even more less so at Q2 than Q3. Now, however, the pricing of housing, it will also impact the equilibrium point that will occur here, E0, and you notice it just kind of climbs up the curve. That's how the demand curve is derived. So M0 traces here, M1 will be kind of tracing here, M2 to E2, M3 to E3. So that's how these two conditions and graphs correlate with each other. Behavioral economics is an alternate framework for consumer choice. And so a traditional model assumes rationality. The consumer always makes a rational choice. People take all the available information and make consistent and informed decisions that are in their best interest. So it assumes that human beings have complete self-control. That sounds like reality, don't it? Fungible is units of goods capable of mutual substitution with each other carry equal value to individual. That's probably something that'll be on the test. Behavioral economics basically takes people's state of mind into account. And so basically, yeah, you could probably speak about it like in terms of the stock market, and you'll hear terms like following the herd. So sentiment has a lot to do with people's choices. That's true for any good, whether it's a financial good or let's say the purchase of paper goods and the purchase of water, let's say during a health crisis or something after a hurricane. So certain goods will take precedence over others almost immediately. And so that's all on the basis of people reacting to a situation. The preferences will change suddenly. Back to the education question. Why spend money to go to college during a recession? If you're unemployed or underemployed, work a few hours and like the opportunity cost of your time is low. Well, that's kind of true. If you're not working and you have the ability to go, well, that's one way to improve your skill sets that make you more employable. If you're unemployed, you don't have to give up work hours or an income to go to college. So you think the data supports the idea that more education means less unemployment? Uh, I would probably think not into this particular instance. Once again, it's when one obtains the education, and there are contradictory instances that have occurred with this, namely during 2008, the financial crisis, the recession of 2008. While there was a high unemployment, there were people getting even technical degrees that wound up taking on jobs that were not what they studied and not for the salaries they would normally earn. So there's no fixed outcome regarding whether or not you get education and the results. However, this often gets quantified, so they talk about it, using data, the impact of education on earnings and unemployment rates. So they're looking at looking at 2012, and so professional degree, median weekly earnings, would be this amount, and the unemployment rate is quite low. Doctoral degree, something less. Master's degree, so this data shows that the higher the degree you have, the better off you are. Um, and going strictly by the numbers, it would appear that this would really hold true that in the longer run that education would result in higher earnings and less unemployment based on this data. End of chapter 6.